everyone. My name is Nyssa Vierssen. I am a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the Canadian public's awareness of bee conservation. Next slide. The work presented here has just been recently published and it is available in early view. So you may take screen caps and tweet about it on social media. And if you choose to do so, please credit us using the above citation. Thank you. Next slide. I don't need to tell this group of people here that pollinators are key to our lives and to biological diversity. But to conserve pollinators and bees specifically, we need to not only understand their biology and the biophysical threats they face, but we also need to understand public awareness of bee conservation with the aim of increasing greater legal protection. Next slide. So we designed a survey to investigate people's perceptions of bees, the threats they face, and overall general knowledge of bees. The survey was conducted by a professional market research company, Oracle Poll Research Limited, and the sample size was 2,000 respondents. Next slide. The entire dataset was categorical, so we used ordinal, multinomial, and logistic regression models to analyze the data. The types of response variables were binary, so yes, no, or agree, disagree, multinomial, agree, don't know, disagree. For ordinal, 1 to 5, from 1, not very concerned, to 5, being very concerned. The predictors included classic demographic predictors such as gender, age, income. We also had stated federal voting intent, the province in which the respondent lived, and whether they lived in an urban or rural area. Next slide. When asked an open-ended question, how many native wild bee species can you name? Oh, just over half of respondents named the honeybee as a wild native bee species to Canada. Other respondents, instead of naming species, gave castes, such as queen bee and drone bee. So this indicates that not only is there confusion among Canadians on what constitutes a native wild bee to Canada, but also on what constitutes a species. Next slide. We asked respondents 5 bee fact awareness questions, where disagree was the correct answer. We found that a majority, 66%, were unsure if honeybees could replace wild native bees as pollinators. We also found that 42% thought that all bees were endangered, and nearly a quarter thought that all bees can sting. Next slide. Respondents were asked to rate their level of concern with bee health using a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being not very concerned, to 5 being very concerned. When we modeled this, we found that Green Party voters were 3.8 times and Bloc voters were 1.9 times more likely to express the highest level of concern, that is 5 and very concerned, compared to Conservative voters. I should say that our sample closely followed the voting profile of the Canadian public, so the bars here are different heights because this reflects quite closely the share of the national vote that each party receives. So for example, the Liberal Party here is at just over 30%, whereas compared to the Greens, it's around 5%. Next slide. Respondents were read a 6-item list and asked if they perceived it as a threat or not. Nearly 90% of respondents agreed that pesticide use was a threat to bees, but interestingly, when we modeled this, This was non-significant on all demographic predictors, and this indicates that there is no difference among predictors, and that could be a broad consensus in the general public that may indicate the success of messaging campaigns by non-governmental organizations. Nearly 80% of respondents agreed that loss of floral resources was a threat to bees. This too was non-significant on all demographic predictors when we modeled it. This may be because it is too technical a term. For habitat loss, disease, climate change, and modern intensive agriculture, we found that consistently left-wing voters were more likely to perceive these as threats compared to conservative voters. And just as an example, found that Green Party voters were nearly 10 times more likely to perceive climate change as a threat to bee health compared to conservative voters. Next slide. Asked an open-ended question, why, if at all, is it important to protect bees? The majority of respondents gave ecosystem service provision as the reason why it is important to protect bees. Less than 8% of respondents were either indifferent or did not know why it was important to protect bees. So this indicates there is a high degree of engagement on this topic. And just some examples of how I categorized responses for this question. If respondents said it's important to protect bees because they're needed for pollination or because they make honey, I classified that as an ecosystem service. Whereas if they said it's important to protect bees because they're endangered or it's good for nature, I classified that as an ecological reason of why it was important to protect bees. Next slide. Respondents were read a 9-item list and asked which entity they thought should be most responsible for bee conservation. The majority of respondents thought that the federal and provincial government should be the most responsible for bee conservation in Canada. This is an important finding because the majority of land in Canada is publicly owned. Interestingly, new democratic parties, that is a left-wing socialist party in Canada, were 1.5 times more likely to attribute the federal and provincial government as the entity that should be primarily responsible for bee conservation compared to conservative party voters. Residents of Manitoba and Saskatchewan were 2.5 times more likely to attribute the agricultural industry, landowners and homeowners as entities that should be primarily responsible for bee conservation compared to residents of Alberta. And elderly people, that is people that are 71 years and over, were 2 times more likely to not know whom to attribute responsibility for bee conservation compared to younger people, that is people who are 18 to 35 years old. Next slide. Respondents were asked, what, if anything, is preventing you from doing more to help bees? 33% of respondents perceived no personal barrier. 24% said they did not know how to help, so this could be a potential target for outreach. Interestingly, 19% stated it was not a priority, but that may tie in with our previous question about the majority of respondents wanting the federal government and provincial government to take the lead in bee conservation, and so therefore they may perceive bee conservation as a top-down process rather than a bottom-up process. Also, urbanites, people that live in urban areas, were 2.7 times more likely to state a lack of resources as a personal barrier to bee conservation. And then they were also 1.5 times more likely to state a fear of bees as a barrier compared to people that live in rural areas. Nearly 75% of Canada's population lives in urban areas, according to Statistics Canada. So that's why these last findings are important. Next slide. Take-home messages from this talk. Canadians value bees for their ecosystem service provision. The distinction between the non-native, managed, or domesticated honeybee and wild native bees is not clear for most people. The majority of people attribute primary responsibility for wild bee conservation to the federal and provincial governments, and the majority of people perceive either no personal barrier or do not know how to help bee conservation. Next slide. So what can you do? Academics have an important role to play in education and outreach. So get out there and talk to people. Next slide. Canadians want the government to take a leading role in bee conservation. Therefore, non-governmental organizations can play a lobbying role. Next slide. I'd like to thank York University and our project partners, the Friends of the Earth Canada. Next slide. And I would be happy to take any questions you might have, and please feel free to tweet me at my Twitter handle @tripnyssa. Thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I hope you enjoyed the conference.
Thank you so much, Nyssa. So we'll give it a minute for people to pop some questions in the chat. So from Amro, so great work that is needed to move bee conservation forward. So Amro's curious, is there any association about knowledge of honeybees and inclination to conserve bees in general?
Sorry, I stopped my screen share, but if you can remember from the one of my earlier figures, where we asked their level of concern, not very concerned to very concerned, and the very concerned 5 on our ordinal scale was that dark purple. And so we found there was a lot of engagement on this issue. Canadians really actually cared about bee conservation. It was more the fact that they, in Canadians' minds, the European honeybee is the bee. It is the bee species. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Go ahead, Amro.
Can I follow up? Because I think this is a very interesting question, and I guess what I'm asking is that, like, I understand that a lot of people are confused about native bees, about honeybees, but for the people that were able to name like one bee, or like including the honey, like, I guess what I'm saying is that the people that named honeybees as like a species of bees they know about, were they more likely to be concerned about bee decline? I guess in general question is like, is whether just like the public knowing that honeybees exist are more likely to kind of make them want to conserve bees in general. Hopefully that makes sense.
Well, okay, let me see if I can answer this. So generally, general bee knowledge was really poor, as I hope I demonstrated with many of the public. Over half of our respondents could only name the honeybee as a wild native bee species, and a quarter thought that all they could sting, like all bees could sting. And we actually only had one respondent that was able to name a solitary bee, the mason bee. So I guess despite not knowing very much about bees, people care about bees. If that's what I can say. Does that help clarify?
I think it does. So we have a question from Sheila. So what was the most challenging part of working with these kinds of data?
So yeah, there was a lot of data. It was a huge data set. And if you go check out our paper, we have 20 pages of supplemental information. And the entire data set was categorical, as I mentioned. So it was just challenging to model And I think an important methodological contribution to this that I made was using multinomial models. So that's where the response is not binary. It's 3 or more responses, but it's not ranked, so it's neutral. So that in our multinomial models in that case were agree, don't know, disagree. And that type of multinomial logistic regression, you don't see that kind of modeling in the conservation science. So I think that was actually a really important methodological contribution that I made.
So I think we'll do one last question before we wrap up. So Amanda was wondering, are you able to tell where the majority of people were getting their bee information from?
We did not ask specifically what media are you consuming. That might be an interesting follow-up study, because I did mention in my presentation, but we did find an effective age in, for example, not knowing whom to attribute primary responsibility for bee conservation. So people who were elderly were more likely to answer, I don't know, as to which entity should be responsible for bee conservation. And that may indicate they're just not as engaged on environmental issues as younger people. It may indicate also that their news sources are not highlighting environmental issues as much, because as we know, social media use is primarily happening among younger Canadians.
Awesome.